Hello and welcome to Finer English. The film you are about to see was made on August the 17th, 2002. It's a recording of a training session with 5 new or newish English teachers with Finer English. The film lasts about an hour and 15 minutes and covers the basics of the Finer English approach. It was a very hot afternoon, so I hope you'll excuse the fact that I was pouring sweat the whole time. Quite apart from the contents, the manner of my presentation is intended as an example of how to present yourself in the classroom, having a plan of what you're going to say and do, speaking clearly, writing clearly on the flip chart or board, checking that your audience, the students, have understood you. In fact, I made a few mistakes. So at the end of this recording of the training session, there will be a short self-evaluation where I will give my own comments on how I could have done better. So, let me tell you the plan for the training session now, the points I intend to cover. I'm going to talk about the audit, which is really the starting point and the basis for our work. I'm going to talk about planning lessons. I'm going to talk about the ingredients of a good lesson, the things that you should put together and mix up as a tasty recipe for your students. I'm going to talk a little bit about teaching grammar, about playing with language, about drilling techniques, about asking questions, in particular asking open questions to get your students talking and to reduce your own talking time. I will also talk a little bit about working with texts, and finally we'll finish with a little exercise for yourselves. The most important thing that you need to do when you first meet a new student or a new group of students is to get to know them. That is your priority. Part of getting to know them is getting to know what their learning needs are in relation to their job. That information is already available to you in the audit, which I'll go over again in a minute. But as you, I hope, will remember in the Code of Practice, which is this little document, which is very short, but I hope very substantial. In the Code of Practice, one of the things it says is we make it our business to understand our students' business. Now, I don't expect any of you to be experts in fertilizers or IT or gas production or drilling for oil or any of these things, but whoever you're teaching, whether it's an insurance specialist or a lawyer or a computer specialist or a salesman or an accountant, make it your business to find out what they really do and let them teach you. You can learn from them. It's fascinating. I mean, a few years ago, before I started working in this way, I didn't know anything about the oil industry. I knew nothing about fertilizers and their ingredients and their production. I hadn't a clue where fertilizer comes from. You know? I didn't know anything about robots. I didn't know much about accounting. I mean, I knew about philosophy and theology because I'd studied that, but I didn't know about these other things. But now I do. I'm not an expert, but I can hold my own in a conversation with an expert. And that should be your goal. That's part of your initial goal, is to get to know your student and to understand his or her work. Another very important thing about the way that we teach, and should be a priority for you, is to engage your students and make every lesson a real experience for them. So that typically when a Wintershall or a Kallienzalz employee gets home from work and their partner says, well, how was it today? Instead of saying, same old stuff, processing invoices all day, he says, it was great. In my English lesson, we practiced telephoning and now I can do it. Yeah? Make it a goal of yours that in every lesson the students have a really rich experience. They're doing things in a foreign language, which is for many of them very difficult. Make it an well, not necessarily exciting, but an enriching experience for them. Something that they feel was time very well spent and enjoyable as well. So, starting with the basics. This is an example of an audit which is given to students. This one for Wintershall and Vingas, but there are others in different forms with different types of questions and different tests for all of the different clients. And in fact at Kassel and Salz, where there seems to be a real variety of different types of work that our students do there. There are people in logistics, there are people in public relations, there are people in potash production, there are lawyers. That I have made about 10 or 12 different versions of this for different departments. That's the starting point. The student fills this in, I analyze the results, and I come up with a report which I submit to the company or to the head of the department. And it looks like this. And the bit that's important for you as a teacher, and which I send you usually by email, is the audit results. And I send you usually a little bit like that, and I typically say, "Dear Katja, here's some notes and the audit results for your new class, short form such and such," and then I give you the phone number, the room number, and my initial impressions. Like, this person seems to be fairly fluent but makes quite a lot of basic mistakes. I would start with such and such as a recommendation. You don't need to follow my recommendation rigidly. It's not like I'm setting down a rule of what you have to teach. Basically, your goal is to teach this person to be able to do all of these things in English. And these are the particular language skills that I've identified as needing improvement. Usually it's things like technical vocabulary for the person's job. And if I say technical vocabulary, then I mean for an accountant talking about invoices, balance sheets, annual reports. If the audit result is for an IT person, then technical vocabulary clearly refers to computer vocabulary, and maybe even quite specialist computer vocabulary, because one person might be responsible for networks, someone else for email systems, someone else for databases, and you use the audit result as a starting point. And if you find in the audit result that there's something that isn't quite right, well, it's possible I made a mistake. It's also possible that the student crossed a box without thinking because he or she was in a hurry or forgot to cross a box. So it's worth checking with your student, but in a fairly informal way, to say, "Look, Joe Fine has told me you need to do this, is that right?" And I would hope that 9 times out of 10 the student says, "Yeah, that's right, I need to improve my telephoning." But that student might also say, "Well, actually there's something else that's more important that I didn't mention to Joe, but I need your help." And then you can add it. Yeah? You can amend this, and you can judge, well, is grammar the first priority, or are writing skills the first priority? What do you judge to be more important? Yeah? What I do is an initial assessment and gives you the basis. From there you can interpret and develop yourself. By the way, if there are any questions at any time, please feel free to ask. So far so good? Okie dokie. Let's move on. So the audit results is your guide for how to plan. Now, for the first lesson, how do you go about planning? Well, I would read the audit results and think about who this person is or who these people are. Then I would look for something interesting that connects with what they do. Usually I would go for a picture. I wouldn't usually take a text into a first lesson, because inevitably when people read a text, imagine I give you all a text, what's the first thing you do? You look down. I break the eye contact. I lose the opportunity to kind of infuse you and give you a good time because you're concentrating on some difficult words. So I wouldn't usually use a text in the first lesson, but I would use a picture or even an object. And particularly if you're teaching, whenever you're teaching for the first time, we are all foreigners here in Germany. And that makes us curiosities for our students. We've all got stories to tell about Oregon, about New York, about Chicago, about Nova Scotia.
New Brunswick.
New Brunswick.
Are you Canadian?
Sorry. But we've all got stories to tell, and your students will want to hear a couple of your stories. Yeah? They'll be curious. They will ask you, what are you doing in Germany? What made you come here? So for that first lesson, you don't really need you don't need written material. You don't necessarily need anything that is specifically related to that student's work, because in that first lesson anyway, you can ask them what they do. You can just say, tell me a bit about it. It says here in the audit that you have to process invoices. Well, what kind of invoices? How often? How many? Why are they in English? Who are they for? Is it easy? Is it difficult? What do you do when you have a problem? Do you need to phone up? Do you need to phone in English? You can think of lots of things to ask in that first lesson, which is basically aimed at breaking the ice, getting to know them, creating a good atmosphere so that they think, at the end of that lesson, they think, I've got an English teacher and she or he is really good and I'm happy. That's the goal for the first lesson. For the second lesson, then I would say it's more important to focus on the student's specific work needs. You've got to know them quite well in the first lesson. You've got my information and you've got your own impression now. Whenever I write a description on paper, it can't capture what it really is to be that person, that student. I can't describe a student or anybody in words. When you sit with that person and you notice how comfortable, how nervous, how they deal with their own mistakes, if they just chatter on and don't care and feel quite confident, or if they really clam up and they really have difficulty, these are things that you notice. What's more, you spend 90 minutes with them. When I meet them to do an oral assessment for the audit, I spend 10 to 20 minutes with them. So you get much more information than I got the first time round. That helps you to plan lesson number 2. And lesson number 2 is, and again I'd refer you to the code of practice, where it says every lesson has a plan and every lesson is part of a bigger plan. That means then for teaching your second lesson, you should actually make a plan on paper. It doesn't have to be a long text or anything like that, just some key points, things that you're going to focus on in that lesson. And for a longer term plan, I would say something like the next 6 weeks, the next 8 weeks, the next 10 weeks, you should be thinking to yourself, with reference to the audit, in the next 8 or 10 weeks, I'm going to cover these grammar areas, I'm going to introduce relevant technical vocabulary, and I'm going to do telephoning skills. That's realistic for these next 6 or 8 weeks. It might be 7, it might be 9, that doesn't matter. But that you know where you're going. And also, a lot of our students, they might want to have the reassurance of knowing that you know where you're going. So it's quite nice if you come into the second lesson and you say, right, today we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and actually over the next month or 2, my plan is to improve your skills in this area and that area. And then they can see that you know what you're doing, and you have structure, you have plan, you've put thought into it, and there's a direction to it. So, what are the ingredients for that second lesson, and in fact for all lessons? What sort of things can you focus on? So, I would say, broadly, there are materials that you can use, like texts, pictures, authentic materials, by which I mean materials that originate from the students, an email that they received recently. I was teaching one of my Wintershaus students last week. She had to reply to about 3 or 4 emails, and she had to make 2 phone calls in English. We spent the 90 minutes. I helped her write the emails. I let her write it, and I said, well, yeah, it's quite good, but it could be better here, and It would be more polite, instead of saying I want, to say could you please send me, things like that. And the telephone conversations we role played. She then typed up the emails, sent them off, and later that day made her phone calls. That's what I call authentic material that comes from the student. It's not out of a newspaper, it's not something that you've dreamed up, it's something that the student has presented to you. Also, thank you very much, also authentic materials I would call also company literature, the annual report. In most of the companies where we teach, you can go into the reception and you can find a stand full of brochures and leaflets and all kinds of stuff. And also on the company websites, you can find relevant material which uses the very vocabulary that your students need to be able to deal with. Yeah, if they're selling or talking about fertilizers and salt, there are different types of salt. I've learned there are about 5 or 6 different types of salt. I never knew that before. I know how salt is produced now as well. It's fascinating. Well, up to a point it's fascinating. It's fascinating in the context of what you're doing. And so pick up the literature and use it as a material in your lessons when it's appropriate. Okay, other materials. Well, let me just say then, ingredients for a good lesson: on the one hand materials, on the other hand activities. So let me just stick with materials for a moment. Oh, that's rather warm orange juice I've got there. Right, texts. Personally, I go for short texts. I look for little items that are 3 or 4 paragraphs long. And the reason is, first of all, it doesn't take so long. No one wants to spend 90 minutes reading a long, difficult text. The student gets a sense of satisfaction if they are able to read a complete, short text and understand it in 15, 20 minutes, whatever it takes. Also, it makes for variety, that you've got time left to do other things as well. And I would take the view that in a good lesson there should be at least 3 or 4 different things that you do. Maybe a reading activity, a discussion activity, a game, a writing activity, a role play, whatever. You can make up and juggle what components, what ingredients to put together and what order to have them in. But I would also say there should be a logical structure to it. There should be a development to it. You shouldn't start off practicing a role play, a telephone role play, and then switch to reading something which is in no way connected. I would try and look for links so that things link and run smoothly from one to the other. You can't always do this, but when it's possible, it makes for a nice cohesive entity. Like a 90-minute lesson is like an event. It's something the student is to some extent, well, the student is obviously a participant in the event, but is also a viewer or a watcher in the event, and you're the director of this event, of this play or performance that's happening. So you can set the scenes, you can set the atmosphere, you can define the content. Other materials, pictures, I think are great to use. Anyone can say something about almost any picture. I probably told most of you this before, illustrating it with the Cliff cartoon, which I like to use personally because it's light, it's funny, and either a beginner can say something about it or an advanced student can say something about it. If I'm teaching someone who's a financial specialist, I would look for a picture that connects to finance. Maybe an advertisement. That's probably the easiest place to find a suitable picture, is to look in any magazine. Yeah, suddenly it goes about 10 degrees cooler. Yeah. Look in almost any magazine and you'll see something like, invest your money here in this fund, it'll be safe and you'll get 50% return and all the rest. Yeah. And
American magazine.
Hmm?
American magazine.
Yeah, and it's full of relevant vocabulary. If you're teaching fertilizer specialist, then maybe I would go more for the company literature, or something from their website, or something from a competitor's website. There's lots of companies that make fertilizer, and they use the same vocabulary as well. So don't limit yourself to just the Kallienzalz or Wintershall company literature. Look elsewhere. Look further afield. You have a question there, Robert?
Just for K&S, Scott's is a big competitor. Scott's fertilizer.
Right.
I found that out, and
Yep.
I don't know if anybody is working with K&S people. You might want to check out Scott's website.
Right. Yes. Yep. If you type in something like potash, or fertilizer, or oil, or gas, or electricity, you'll get 50 websites. Yeah.
Do you know what the website is? You do, yeah, but I'm sorry.
Top of my head.
It's easy to find.
Yeah.
Scott, if you just type in Scott, you'll
Under a
find
search
it.
engine, yeah.
Yeah. I was talking about pictures. Pictures you'll find of course, in magazines. I have a large library here where materials are grouped in categories, and you're very welcome to browse through any time and grab a picture. Going back to texts, what makes a text a relevant text? Well, a relevant text is sure to have relevant vocabulary in it. Yeah? So whatever the subject area of your students, try and find something that relates to them, where they will in fact be grateful that they're picking up some vocabulary that they can use in their work. Other materials, of course, are Grammar Matters. Grammar Matters is the material that you all have a copy of, which I wrote myself. It's very minimalistic. It presents the simple past in 2 sentences. It presents conditionals in 1 page. It presents the passive in 1 page. Other grammar books, even good grammar books, like this one, which is the elementary version, but also I think you have the intermediate, and there's also
advanced.
and there is an advanced as well. This book I consider to be great for reference. For reference, yeah. If you are going to teach the present perfect and you're not sure, then read it up in Murphy. But if I were going to teach the present perfect, I wouldn't hand out photocopies from Murphy. It is so dry.
Question.
Yeah.
I have a few classes at K&S and they love working through those exercises. They beg for them.
Yeah. Working through exercises is something that I personally would not do in a lesson, because students can work through exercises at home. Again, it's
As a jumping off point, sometimes we
okay.
take a long time to work through the exercises and we spend maybe 5 minutes on the exercise and we go in other places.
sure.
with
Then
that
that's
grammar.
that's fine. If it's a stepping stone on the way, but I would never spend a chunk of time working on exercises, unless the students requested it. But again, I would hope that the students would want to do more active and more interesting things. Because you see, if you take, and just chance it here, you take any exercise and it says, I want to wash my hair. Is there, and you have to write the answer, any shampoo? Well, okay, it's a valid little exercise, and it falls under the category of general grammar. The is there, are there. It also falls under the category of general vocabulary, shampoo, hair. But I would much rather say to the student, if I was teaching is there and are there, I would say, are there any accountants in your department? Are there any invoices on your desk? Are there any marketing companies that work with you? In other words, I would prefer to try and incorporate relevant vocabulary into my exercises. What's more, I would make my exercises oral because it's much more fun. Of course, there's more input for you. If you hand out an exercise, then I'm not suggesting, Scott, that it's like this when you do this, but I know from watching other teachers at times and feedback from students, I know what can happen. You give out an exercise, And the teacher sits, and it becomes, okay, Katya, can you do number 4? Katya gives her answer, very good. Jenny, number 5, please. And Rob's gone to sleep because he knows he's number 7, so he can think about lunch for the next minute, and he knows that Scott's probably going to get it wrong, and then I'm going to have to talk and explain it, and we're going to look up the answer, and Aaron is completely somewhere else. So I would much rather present an oral question to you and then jump to you and then get you to ask her a question and you to ask him a question, and then you all have to write 2 questions and swap sheets, and I would make it much more lively. Yeah? By all means, use it for yourself to make sure you know the grammar, and give it out as a homework, perhaps, exercises to practice at home. And if the students really want to do it, okay. But it wouldn't be my personal choice. So, do you have a question there at all, or a comment?
I just wanted to add, I have some students that actually went and bought the book.
Yeah.
Because
A lot of students do buy it.
Yeah.
That's fine. But I would say to the students, it's good to work on at home.
We've spent sometimes the whole lesson on one of these grammar sheets, but never just sitting there going from one answer to the other. It
Right.
always goes off on some related tangent
yeah.
that's wonderful most of the
Okay.
time.
Okay.
So it ends up being the oral exercises with their own vocabulary and explaining the rules a little more thoroughly
Right.
and going in this direction and that direction. So as a jumping off point, they're wonderful.
Okay.
But if we sat and did, I thought too, doing these is going to be boring, but I've had students request them.
Okay, I suppose it's what you make of them.
Mm-hmm.
That if you let the students just go around in a predictable way, giving their answers, and you're only really looking at whether or not they got their bit right, and you've neglected to focus on their intonation. You know, is there any shampoo? You know, you can't say very good, that's just perfect, because it's not really. You can say it's a good try, but let's do it again. Is there any shampoo? You know, put some life into your question, and you can do that much more orally than them filling in the blanks and reading or whatever.
I have some students that, one student told me last week, he said, I have no interest in studying English at home, and he said, so whatever we do in class, I want it to be, beneficial for me.
Absolutely.
And I said, well, okay. But then I have other students that are asking me for homework. So I guess I just have to accommodate each student.
My policy is at the end of every lesson, I offer a homework. I say, if you would like a homework, then I would suggest that you do this. Write a little text using the new vocabulary. Write 3 questions using the present perfect. Find an email that contains relevant vocabulary for you, and we'll do an exercise next week based on that. Finish off reading the rest of the article. Whatever, write up the vocabulary. Always give a homework. Whether they do it or not depends on A, whether they've got time, and B, whether they're interested and motivated enough. A lot of our students, I would say 99% of our students are highly motivated, but they have high workloads and they don't have the time outside of class. So whatever the student needs should really happen in class, and you shouldn't rely on them doing their homework. Also, you shouldn't rely on them doing their homework for your next lesson. Don't plan your lesson on the basis of the students having done their homework. Like, the main thing we're going to do next week is go through your homework, because if none of them have done it, then you've got nothing for your lesson.
Except going through the homework.
Yeah.
In class.
Right. Another thing I would say is always have more things ready in your lesson, for your lesson, than you will really use. I think I mentioned earlier 3, 4 or 5 different activities or types of materials, whatever we want to call them, in the course of the 90 minutes. But always have 6 or 7, because the students who come might not be the students who you expect to come. You might have a new face, you might only have 1 instead of 3, in which case it might not be appropriate to do what you had planned to do. If you had planned to have a debate, where you're going to have these two people argue for this and these two people argue against it, and there's only one person there, you can't have your debate. You need to have something else. So always have your bag full of other things.
You've been reading my weekly table. That happened to me twice in the past 2 weeks.
Okay. I always have many more things, and of course a lot of things in my head. Yeah. If the time, you've done according to your plan, and there's still 10 minutes left, you should have some ideas for fillers, games, which I would put under the general category of activities. I was talking primarily about materials, saying there's different types of materials. There's short texts of any type, authentic materials, pictures which are relevant to the student's work, where you can find a connection to the student's work. There's grammar matters. There are, of course, a stack of books where you can selectively choose an activity or a text or a picture which you feel is particularly of interest to your student. Yeah? Are you following me? Mm-hmm. Yeah? Okay. I've got a lot of books in the teaching room which you're very welcome to browse through and borrow, and of course you've probably got books, and there's newspapers, there's magazines, there are specialist technical magazines about every subject under the sun, and there are specialist websites about every subject. So if you can't find relevant material yourself, come to me. I will either give you relevant material or give you guidance on where to find it. I also have material for particular skills, telephoning skills, presentation skills, writing skills, and many of our students have these points listed on their audit. So if you're going to teach telephoning skills, you really should have the telephoning skills material that I provide, unless you think you've got something better. Fair enough. Yeah? But those sorts of items should constitute the materials that you're going to use. Now, moving on to ideas for activities. There are games, and there are dozens of games to play. And in the past, in our teachers' meetings, we have had a session about games, and everyone's made us all play a game or introduced a game. There are lots of games you can play. Word games of every variety, quiz games, question games, all kinds of stuff. Other activities, role plays, of course. Role playing a meeting. You might be familiar with a little sheet that I've written called Breaking the Ice, which is basically how to meet someone and do small talk. Small talk is important because it leads to big talk. When two business people meet, when I say business people, I mean also a computer support person and someone from Sweden who's coming to sell some new software. I mean, I don't mean necessarily top executives, but all of our people are business people. And when they have a meeting with someone for the first time in English, they need to know how to introduce themselves, how to greet the other person, how to say, please have a seat, would you like something to drink, how was your journey, how was your hotel, have you been in Germany before? And that then is the transition to the big talk about the contract and the price and all the rest. Please, if you haven't done so, look at that sheet called Breaking the Ice. It will help you a lot, and it's a role play. I mean, it gives you the substance to play it out. You can be the guest, and you come to visit this person, your student, and they have to make you welcome and have a little small talk with you. There are also discussion topics. Most texts can lead to a discussion, and if I just zip back to talking about texts for a minute, I often use texts as a means to discussion, as a stepping stone. I take the view that it's not necessary to read any text to the end. You can read the first 3 or 4 paragraphs. That sets up the topic and raises some issues, whether it's about fertilizer sales or computer problems or electricity supply, whatever it is, and then go off away from the text and get the students talking. So any kind of discussion material. Lost my place. Again, you can find lots of material in the library but of course in magazines, newspapers, the internet, everywhere. I said you should have a plan, but I think you will guess from what I've also said about the fact that you don't always know who's going to come to your lesson and what mood they're going to be in. They might be exhausted and say, oh really, I don't feel like working on a text. Can we just talk about something today? Maybe play a game or two? Then, although you've got a plan, you don't have to stick to it. Be flexible. React to your students' needs and their mood and their energy levels and also the number of people you've got.
I have a question. This
Yeah.
has happened to me just a couple of times when I have a group of maybe 2 or 3 and let's say we happen to be working on a text and we're reading it and maybe we're about halfway in and then someone shows up late. How do you deal with that? Because on one hand you have 2 people who have already been reading it and they don't necessarily want to. Up until now I've usually had them kind of summarize it instead of reading it, but is that usually?
That's
Okay.
what I would do.
I just want to double check I was doing the right thing.
I would, I mean, if the person walks in while one of your students is in the middle of reading a sentence, then I would just make eye contact and say, "Right," and let your student continue and finish to the end. And if that student wants to ask a question or wants to say something, let them, and then after not too long, address the newcomer, who will probably apologize and give an explanation about the computer broke down or there was traffic or whatever it is. So you break the ice with that student and with the group because it's a difficult moment for everyone. It's embarrassing for the latecomer. The other students feel, he's late, or he's late again, or something like that. So you want to make sure you maintain a happy atmosphere, and then you have to sense what's the best thing to do. Is it to say to the student, we're actually in the middle of reading a text, and then you say, Stefan, could you just give us a short summary of what we've read so far, and you give the newcomer a copy of the text, and he becomes integrated into that activity, and you move on as if he'd been there all the time. Alternatively, if you can sense this from the other students, if the other students are happy to hear the newcomer tell the story about his traffic jam or having to go to the doctor or whatever, and maybe he's a bit excited and wants to tell this story, then let him. Yeah? I think you have to play it by ear.
Let it unfold.
You have to sense what your students feel comfortable with. Yeah,
Okay.
and you can ask them. You can say, maybe should we leave the text here now? Yeah, and see how they react to that.
We had a situation, class of 4. One guy wrote a very long article, tax article, went on vacation, and we happened to work on the article while he was gone. We all hated it. It was really boring, but we got some good vocabulary out of it. When he came back, he's like, okay, so can we read the article now? And we all just went, oh, well, we sort of did that while you were out. But each one of the other members of the group summarized it for him, and his homework was to read it again so we could debate it. So it worked out, because I was like, oh, we're not going to go through that article again.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, like
Sorry.
you said, go with the flow.
So to summarize so far, your first lesson is really your most important lesson. It should be a positive experience for your students and an opportunity for you to refine what you already know about the students based on the audit. And it should be a means to planning the future lessons. And for your second lesson, you should have a clear plan of where you're going, and if you think your students would benefit from it, you should indicate to your students what that plan is, what you intend to be doing with them over the next few weeks. Okay. Maybe we take a 2-minute break there. I'm pouring sweat, and we might want to go to the loo or whatever.
Stretching. Have a cigarette for whoever smokes.
So, when it comes to teaching a grammar point, let's say you've decided you want to teach your students how to use the present perfect. One way to do it is simply to say, here's some sheets on the present perfect, and everyone looks, yeah? And then you say, Rob, could you read from the beginning, please? And he reads, the present perfect is used for... You could do it like that, but it's not very engaging. And I would rather do it by asking a question that uses the present perfect. Let's assume we're doing the present perfect. I would either ask questions that uses the present perfect to see if I can elicit a correct answer or what kind of mistakes come, and alternatively I would present, you can present the Murphy material. It's not that Murphy is wrong, he's spot on, and he's very compact, but it's much more interesting for the students to see you create those rules step by step, and you can maintain the eye contact, and it's simply more enjoyable to watch, for the students to watch you presenting it. And again, it's very much presenting than for them to read it. Yeah? Once they've got this sheet of paper and they're reading it, to a certain extent you don't really need to be there anymore. If they can understand it, then they can do it at home. Yeah. So you bring it to life. So I start off with saying, Katja, how long have you been in Germany?
I have been in Germany for 3.5 months.
Very good. I have been in Germany for 3.5 months. Is absolutely correct. And that is actually the present perfect tense. Let's try another one. Rob, how long have you known me?
I have known you for 2 years.
Okay, can you say it again, please?
I have known you for 2 years.
Okay, I think there was something wrong there. Did you notice anything wrong in his answer?
Since 2 years?
I have been knowing.
I have been knowing. Okay, well that's a variation. Can you say again what you said the first time, Rob?
I have known you for 2 years.
I am known you for 2 years. Let's write that up.
I have known you for 2 years.
Excellent, excellent. And what is special about the present perfect is that we use the verb to have plus what we call in grammar the past participle. Now you don't need to be experts in grammar, but there are certain grammar terms which are useful to know. Now the verb to have, I think you know. Jenny, can you say the verb to have? I
have, you have, he has,
Good, good.
we have, and they have.
Very good, okay. And what's distinctive about it is that it's he, she, and it has with an S. Right? Now, the past participle, all verbs have 3 parts. They have the infinitive, they have the simple past, what we call the simple past in English, and they have the past participle. And if you look up any verb in a good English dictionary, it will normally, it'll say to think, and then it'll have in brackets thought, and you can get tables where these irregular verbs are listed. So let's just familiarize ourselves with a couple of verbs. Scott, to write, what's the past tense of to write?
Wrote.
Wrote, very good. It's irregular. And the past participle, Aaron, would be?
I have written.
Or not just the past participle. To write, wrote.
Wrote.
No. Yeah.
Written.
Very good, excellent. Okay. That's an important one to know. If you just put your book down, otherwise
okay.
the camera
Sorry.
only sees your book.
Oh.
Okay. To write, wrote, written. Now, when it comes to making the present perfect, we need the verb to have, either I have, and then the past participle. So we could say, for example, I have written I have written. Can someone finish that sentence? Make it a realistic sentence. What have you written today? Have you written any emails today? Jenny, what could you say? I've written
2 papers this weekend.
a bit louder, please.
I've written 2 papers this weekend.
This weekend. Very good. And what is very important, and the most important thing really about the present tense, because what I've explained so far is simply how to make it, but when we use it when we're talking about a period of time that started in the past and goes until now. So when Jenny says this weekend, well, when did your weekend start, Jenny, for you?
Yesterday.
Okay, so like Friday evening?
Yeah.
Okay, so we mean here from Friday evening until now. That's what we mean when we say this weekend. We mean from Friday evening until now, Saturday afternoon. We use the present perfect whenever we're talking about a period of time that started in the past and goes until now. For example, if we want to talk about this month or this year, when I say I have been to a Chinese restaurant 3 times this year, what I actually mean is from the 1st of January until now. And if I say I have spent 100 euros this week, then for me my week starts on a Monday morning. So I mean from Monday morning until now. We're always talking about a period of time from the past until now. Is that clear for everyone?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I go out of the role play now, and that was to illustrate that actually, I would hope, it's more entertaining, it's more engaging, things are clearer, things come to life much more than reading the same rules, which Murphy presents in a very similar way, but he does it over several chapters as well. And I would present like this, I would then practice it, I would write up, I would ask you questions and elicit your answers and write your correct answers. Maybe I'd go back to this, and I'd write things like, I have lived in Kassel for, you have worked for Wintershall for, he has written 3 emails this week, etc. You have to, particularly for beginners. If you're teaching more advanced students, then really you're jogging their memory, and maybe it's enough just to point out something like this. If they start saying, for example, yesterday I have been in Frankfurt, then it's enough to point out why it's wrong by doing this little drawing. Okay, so that's how I would want to demonstrate or how to teach a grammar point, whether it's present perfect or conditionals or some and any or much and many or whatever it is. I would start with asking questions. I would demonstrate on the flip chart, or if it's a one-to-one lesson, I would demonstrate on a sheet of paper and turn it round to the student, and then I would practice it. And I would also, wherever possible, look for opportunities to play with the language. Yeah? I'm moving away from talking about grammar now. What I mean is, when you're talking about a point of vocabulary, I mean, tell me any word at all in English.
Metamorphosis.
Metamorphosis.
Right.
Metamorphosis is a word that comes from the Greek, and from the Greek language, and it means change. Metamorphosis is in fact change, and you might know other words that contain the part of that word morph, M-O-R-P-H. So let's just write this word up. Oh. Well, in your classroom you probably won't have to fight with sunflowers. Metamorphosis. Means change. actually it means a change in the form of something. Can you think of any other words that contain this part?
Morphine.
Hmm?
Morphine.
Morphine, yeah, I don't know if that's actually related. It could well be. I'm not sure about that. Any other words?
Morph. Morph.
Morph.
Mhm.
M-O-R-P-H?
Mhm.
What does that mean?
It's the verb from
To morph something.
mhm.
Uh-huh. What does that mean, Rob?
To change.
To change something. Is that slang?
Uh,
Or is that standard English
I
or
would-
standard American English?
I would say standard American.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So
Standard.
can I say WorldCom morphed their balance sheet?
Into something very creative.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Fine, okay.
It's not common.
It's like you say, it's more of morphing a form.
Okay. To change the form of
form,
something.
yeah. Like Arnold Schwarzenegger morphs into Terminator.
Right. Okay.
Sometimes he even morphs into an actor.
Okay. There are lots of words actually that come from Greek. In the English language, there are many words that come from Greek, and meta means beyond. So we have words like metaphysics and
Meta language.
meta-language. And those of you who work with computers know about HTML. You've probably heard of meta tabs. I actually don't know exactly what they are, but maybe you can explain. So I go back out of the role play now. But what I want to illustrate here is that with almost any word, and Rob gave me a pretty tricky one actually, and morph is not a word that figures in my vocabulary, but I've heard it. And
It is slightly slang. actually.
okay, yeah. But the point I'm trying to illustrate is that you can come across any word, and probably there's something you can say about it. You can look at words that are related to it. You know, if it's a noun, there's probably a verb that goes with it. There might also be an adjective. Then you could ask if the word is an adjective, you could ask what's the opposite of that, or what's a synonym? What's another word you could use that has the same or a similar meaning? So try to bring the language to life. All languages are living things, and they're fascinating. And your students will also, without being linguists or whatever, they will get a little buzz out of seeing where words come from and how they're connected. Scott?
It often comes up that a student has learned a noun, one meaning of a noun, and there are many. And sometimes if I'm using it in a context that they're not familiar with, they'll say, wait, I thought that word meant this.
Yeah.
And that brings out a whole interesting vocabulary
Right.
tangent that's often very exciting.
Right, absolutely. It's a point that actually I had on my list, that many words have more than one meaning. And when a student says to you, what does reservation mean? Well, it has more than one meaning. I can think of three immediately. Yeah? And this is completely spontaneous. Yeah? Reservation is what you do for a hotel. It's also where First Nations people, as they're called in Canada, the land that they live on is called a reservation. And you might have reservations about telling me all the detail about your confidential business. You might have some feelings that hold you back or reserve you. So, from one word, you can amplify, demonstrate the variety of meanings, variety of usages. You can talk about British and American usage, slang and formal usage. Whatever you can say about a word, do it. Yeah, the students will love it.
It's fun.
It's
We
fun,
have a lot of that,
absolutely.
actually.
Yeah. That was in fact my next point. That's lovely.
I'm sure
And-
it's coming up.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much.
It's only,
Oh,
my clock is, my watch is 10 minutes fast.
oh, I'm sorry.
Mhm.
I'm sorry. I was looking at your watch.
Does that trick you into being on
What did
time?
meta mean again?
I don't know why it doesn't work.
6 minutes, please. If you can tell me 6 minutes.
What does meta mean?
Beyond.
Oh, beyond.
So you can talk about origins of words, multiple meanings, idioms, idiomatic phrases like having someone over a barrel, pulling someone's leg. Students love these things. Yeah? If that falls into the category of general vocabulary, small talk skills. Any of your students who've got small talk on their audit, teach them a few idioms. They will love it. It will amuse them and they can use it. You know, teach them appropriate idioms, of course. Proverbs. You know, when you hear a word like camel, wow, you know, the associations, yeah? You know, from the Bible and getting a camel through the eye of a needle, camel cigarettes, slang usage, formal usage. There's a lot that you can do just by playing with language and displaying an enthusiasm and delight in the language. Drilling techniques. Going to a new topic now. Drilling techniques is something that's very good to do with elementary students and weak lower intermediate students who are struggling to get it right. You put a little bit of pressure on them. And let's do a role play now. I'm going to ask you questions in the present perfect, and all I want you to do is give me a short answer. You can either say, yes I have, or no I haven't. Okay? So, have you ever been to Japan?
No, I haven't.
Okay, see if we can do it a little bit quicker. Have you ever been to China?
Yes, I have.
Has she ever been to China?
Yes, she has.
Good. Have you ever seen the film Terminator 2?
Yes, I know I haven't.
Okay, let me ask you that again. Have you ever seen the film In the Heat of the Night?
No, I haven't.
Okay, have you ever seen In the Heat of the Night?
No, I haven't.
Have they ever seen In the Heat of the Night?
No, they have not.
Good. So there you are, that's drilling, putting people under a little bit of pressure and eliciting a quick response from them. It's fun to do. It's only really appropriate for students who are very, very rusty or learning the grammar for the first time. It's also fun. You know? Dance around, and because you're hopping from one to the other, nobody can fall asleep. They've all got to have you can say, have you ever been to California, Aaron? Yeah? And then she goes, oh, yes. Yeah? And everyone else knows that it could have been them, so they have to have the answer ready as well. Asking open questions, to move on to another point. If I ask a student, is it difficult to program your software for the new customer? The student can say yes. Then I've got to ask another question. So we have teacher talking time, 20 seconds, student talking time, 1 second. And then I say, is it difficult because it's difficult to understand the manual? Yes. So I think I need to think of another question. And the student is saying nothing. So don't ask these closed questions. Ask instead a question like, why is it difficult for you to program the new software? Oh, it's difficult because, and then the student starts to explain. And while the student, no?
I often get because it's hard. Point.
Okay. Then you say, why is it hard? But what I was going to say was, while the student is giving you their answer, you're thinking of the next question. Instead of saying, do you sell a lot of fertilizer to Brazil? Yes. You can ask, tell me about Brazil. What are sales like to Brazil? Our sales, well, in the past they were really quite good, but now there are some difficulties. Oh, really? What are the difficulties? Well, because of the economic situation in Brazil, I'm probably speaking much more fluently than your student might, but your student has to explain, has to give you an answer. The student gives you an answer, and then you ask another question related to the economy or the impact on the company and the share price and all the rest. So always be one jump ahead, and if you ask an open question, a question that can't have a simple yes and no answer, then you minimize your own teacher talking time, which is something to be very aware of. In 90 minutes, let's imagine you've got 2 students. If it's democratic, there's 3 of you, each speaks for 30 minutes. Should be even that you speak for maybe 20 and they speak for 35 each, if my arithmetic is right. Yeah? Or you try and minimize how much time you spend talking. You have to speak to explain things. You have to speak to give instructions, to provide the stimulus, to ask the questions. But when they get going, then just feed them a little bit more. Tell me more, tell me more. Say it again another way. Yeah?
Question. And difficult students that are particularly passive or afraid of making grammatical mistakes so they don't want to talk, how can you get them to come out a little bit more?
Okay. Can I answer that question in just a minute? I'm going
Yes.
to change the tape.
Okay.
Scott, can you just repeat your question, please?
The question was, in classes where you ask open questions and the students are still hesitant to speak, either because they're afraid of making a grammatical mistake or because they are simply uncomfortable speaking, how to get them to come out more?
Okay. I would tell them, first of all, don't worry about the grammar mistakes. Try and formulate your idea. Try and give me an answer. And if they only give you a short answer, I would maybe write it up on the board, yeah? Or write it on my own paper, and then try and get them to build on it so they can see what they've said already. Maybe we do a little role play. Who would you like to, or what job would you like to be at which company?
Computer worker, accounting office.
Okay, so and what do you do in computing in English?
Maybe an email once a month.
Okay, so we're going to role play. Scott, have you written any emails about you in your work since I last saw you?
No?
You don't write emails very often?
No?
Okay, let's imagine that someone sends you an email with a computer problem. Can you think of what they might say, what the problem might be about?
No.
Would it be maybe that they're asking you for help?
Maybe.
Okay. Would they ask you to send them an email reply?
Maybe.
Okay. Let's imagine then, I'm a user, computer user, and I have a problem, so I write to you and I say, Dear Scott, my printer doesn't print properly. And then he goes on to say that he wants your help. He knows nothing about printers. You know a lot about printers, don't you, Scott?
Mm-hmm.
And you've told me before that you're a specialist for printer problems.
Mhm.
Yeah. So if his printer doesn't work properly, what could be the possible reasons for that?
I would look it up.
But you're an expert, don't
Mhm.
you? You know lots of possible reasons,
Mhm.
don't you?
But I would look it up to be
Okay.
sure my grammar's right.
Okay. To be sure your grammar's right.
Mhm.
Yeah, but don't worry about the grammar right now. Just tell me, if someone's printer doesn't work, what could it possibly be? Maybe we make a list of possible reasons why a printer doesn't work.
That's too hard.
Well, let me give you an idea. It's not switched on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? That's probably what the manual would say. First thing, check, is it switched on, yeah? I mean, I'm not a computer specialist, but I have read some of these manuals and they say things like that. What would it also say? What would be the next thing to look for?
I'd have to look.
Okay, let's go out of the role play. You're being incredibly difficult. Do you have
I
a
get
student
this.
that's
I
reading
They're
have
one
like this.
Yes.
Who's like that?
Absolutely.
Without naming anyone? I mean, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have one or I don't, not all of them. I'd say 95% of my students want to engage in speaking English, but there are a few of them that will not speak unless, and I found out from one of them, a little personal aside, we had a personal conversation one day, and I found out it was because she was terribly afraid of making a mistake
Okay.
in English grammar, and she felt that the other person in the class's grammar in English was better than hers.
And was it? Sorry, just a minute.
A little bit.
Okay. I think first of all, then you have to reassure the person that just as we make mistakes in German, and if they didn't make mistakes, they wouldn't
Usually
need
I'll
these
use a little
lessons.
bit of German and make some mistakes
Yeah,
in German so that they
if-
feel comfortable.
If they didn't make mistakes, then they wouldn't be here and I'd be out of a job.
Mhm.
Yeah? My job is to identify their mistakes and help them to reduce the number of their mistakes. So they shouldn't.
I
you
say
should-
it in both languages. Mistakes are our friends. We learn a lot from them.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Katya, you said also you have students who just clam up, they won't say a word?
Yeah, and similar to what Scott was saying, it's because sometimes I have groups where they're put together more so because they're departmentally the same than they are level-wise.
Mm-hmm.
Not often, but in a couple of my groups, I really do seem, or in the beginning when it seemed like, according to maybe audit results, they were on the same level. When it comes to maybe one of them is strong in writing, the other one is completely apprehensive or introverted when it comes to speaking and oral participation, even though that's the number one thing they want to improve.
Okay. So I would say generally, if you find in any of your classes that you feel the students do not fit as a group, either because of their ability in English or their use of English at work, if I've made a mistake in the audit, or their characters, their personalities, please tell me. Please write it in the remarks column of the weekly table, and I will take action immediately. Yeah? It could be that someone is just incredibly inhibited, and they're better off having one-to-one lessons for 1 month to build their confidence, and then they go back to the group and they're okay. Yeah? This does happen. But if you feel that the students, I've matched them wrongly, they're different abilities, or I've misunderstood something, or simply made a mistake, please tell me. Yeah? Because each group should be a pretty coherent, happy little entity. Yeah? Good.
Those things usually do improve over time when they get used to each other.
Okay. Maybe I haven't answered your question 100% thoroughly. It's very difficult if you get a student who's as unforthcoming as you were. Yeah. I mean, I asked you lots.
I was
of things.
actually giving you more than she would normally give me.
Good. Okay.
But yeah, she's okay now.
Yeah.
I mean,
But,
but at the beginning of the
you know, you have to keep generating questions, and then maybe break things down into their simple elements to get students to say one little thing and then another little thing, and then you can ask the same question again. If you've got it all written down, if you've elicited answers step by step and you've got it written down, then you can go back to the first question and say, tell me what you would say to the person if they had their problem. And then you would say, I would ask them if the printer's switched on. I would ask them to check that the cable is plugged in properly. I would ask them to check that the cartridge has got ink in it, etc., etc. Yeah? So you can help the student formulate a real answer. If I can move on, using texts. We use a lot of texts off the internet, from newspapers, magazines, from me, etc. If you make a photocopy of it, make sure it's a neat photocopy. That it hasn't slipped and that it's smudged, or you haven't got it all crooked, or you haven't chopped off the last word of the line or something. Make it a nice document that the student, when they see it, they think, oh, this is fine, I'm happy to read this. Not that it looks amateurish and rough. So that's the first thing. Secondly, any text that you read, that you're going to read with your students, read it yourself first. And if there's any vocabulary there, well, for all the vocabulary that's there, you should be able to give a definition of that word or explain the grammatical structure. So if you're using a text which has a word that maybe is not so familiar to yourself, and none of us are so well read that we know every word in the English language, I often come across a text and there's a word in it and I think, I think I know what it means. But I immediately go to my dictionary and check it, yeah? Just to make sure that when the student says, what does defamatory mean? What's the difference between defamation and slander? That I have an answer ready. Yeah? If I don't know it, then I find out before. Don't go and give your students a text, and then in the second paragraph there's a word and they say, what does defunct mean? And you go, ooh, defunct. I think I'll have to look that one up. That doesn't look good. Yeah? You should know what every word in the text means. Yeah?
A lot of times they bring stuff to class that they want to work on that day, and you encounter words sometimes that you don't know ahead of time and you haven't had a chance to read the text.
Fair enough. Then you say, I think it means this, but I'm not sure. I'll check it and tell you next week. That's okay.
Exactly what.
You know, if they've brought the text to you, that's all
Yeah.
right. That happens. And
Scary with legal texts
right.
when they do that.
Yeah, sure. But with the text that you present, you should be ready to answer any question about that text, about the meanings of words, the grammatical structure, the real meaning of this sentence. You should be able to paraphrase any difficult portion of that text, to put it in your own words, in simple words that the students will understand. When you're defining a word, this goes back to what we were talking about before. Someone asked, what does this word mean in the text? Well, it might have multiple meanings. So you can say, here in this context it means this, but in another different context it has a different meaning. Yeah? And that's interesting to talk about the variety of meanings. Provide definitions, give examples of the use of the word, and also with any text that you use, think of good questions that you can ask about the text. You can always ask comprehension questions, like it says, President Bush announced a series of staged cuts in income tax beginning in December, and you can ask, what has he announced? Or when will the tax cuts begin? Or what kind of tax cuts will there be? But those are straight comprehension questions. Go a level further, deeper, and say, why does Bush want to reduce the taxes? Will this be popular amongst the people? What would happen if Schroeder announced this plan? What do you think about it? Think of lots of other more deeper, open questions that spring from the text but are not simply comprehension questions. So any text that you're going to use, read it through first, be ready to answer any question about it, and think of some good questions that you can pose to the students while you're reading the text. Typically I would read one paragraph, check the understanding, read another paragraph, check the understanding, and then ask a question that generates a little comment or discussion, read a couple more paragraphs, check the understanding, and then be ready to open out into a discussion if the students are into it.
News briefs are good that way too.
Sorry?
News briefs
Yes.
are good because they're generally on a topic like business or politics, and they're short, and they generate a lot of discussion and a lot of new vocabulary.
Right.
usually.
Yeah. Their being short is very nice because, as I said before, it gives the students a sense of satisfaction that they can read and understand the complete text. Good. Finally, we come to your bit now. I've tried to
Activity.
comment on lots of different things that we do as teachers and give you a few tips on how to deliver a good lesson. And all the time I've been presenting, and sometimes I've presented well, sometimes I've presented not quite so well. There have been moments when I've had to look at my notes and couldn't maintain the eye contact, but I've done my best, and probably it's adequate, yeah? Adequate to above average, I would hope, yeah? To give a good presentation, and I must emphasize, almost everything you do as a teacher is a kind of presentation. You need preparation, you need planning, you need structure, you need clarity, you need positive body language, to look confident, to look like you know what you're talking about and you're not hesitating and forever looking in the book. You need eye contact to maintain the interest of your students, and you need a friendly manner. You need to be open for a laugh and open to the responses from the students, and you need flexibility. You need a readiness to leave your plan and do something else if need be. So, to my self-evaluation, I made a couple of mistakes during my training session. One of my mistakes was to have all of my notes on one sheet of paper. I thought that it would be easier to have one sheet than two, so I printed it out with very small type. As a result, I had to move forward each time to be able to read it. It would have been better to print my notes on 2 sheets or even 3 sheets of paper with larger print, spaced out, so I would have been able to read it much more easily and with less hesitation. Secondly, and perhaps an even more important mistake, when a teacher asked a question, instead of focusing my attention on the speaker, of course I listened to the speaker, but instead of looking at the person who was asking a question, I used this as an opportunity to check my notes. So very often when someone else was speaking, I was looking down at my notes. It's not such good practice. I think in the classroom I would try to avoid doing that, and when the student was speaking I would look at the student and ensure that the student realizes that I have that he or she has my full attention. Perhaps not a mistake, but there were a few points which I forgot to mention in that training session, and they are important, so it was a mistake insofar as that I left out some essential points. So let me use this opportunity now to compensate. I would say that being good in a foreign language is a question of achieving a balance between, on the one hand, fluency, and on the other hand, accuracy. If a person is fluent, by which I mean they can speak continuously, sentence after sentence, but if they lack accuracy, then the result is that the listener doesn't understand them, or misunderstands them, or it sounds horrible. It's fluent and continuous, but because of its lack of accuracy, it's not effective. On the other hand, if a student is so concerned to speak accurately the whole time that he or she is unable to speak fluently and has long pauses while they're considering the correct choice of word or the correct grammatical construction, and then there are, as a consequence, long pauses between phrases or between sentences, this becomes absolutely boring for the listener. So the ideal is to be as accurate as possible while being as fluent as possible. And these are 2 points that you as a teacher should have in mind when you're teaching, when you're listening to your students. Encourage them on the one hand to be fluent, on the other hand to be accurate. Be aware of your own voice. As the teacher, you are the example of how one should speak. So if you mumble, if you mispronounce, if you slur, if you drop your H's, if you drop your G's at the end of a word that is a gerund ending in a G, like listening, if you speak in a slang, broken style of English, your students will imitate you. But this is not our goal. So speak clearly, speak accurately, and when you do use slang, make clear that you are using slang. Your intonation is also very important, as is the student's intonation, and your volume. Make sure you speak loud enough that everyone can hear you clearly, but not so loud that you impose yourself on the students and make them wish that you would turn the volume down a little bit. Another point that I did not address in the training session is the question, how important is it to be able to speak German when you're teaching English to Germans? I would say that it is only of minor importance, and that is why some of our English teachers start here in Kassel not being able to speak German. There are, however, 2 instances where I would consider it very useful to be able to speak German in the classroom. One is when, after using all possible means in English, explaining, giving a definition, giving examples using a word, miming, drawing pictures, if after all of that a student still does not understand what you mean, then it would be time effective to simply say the word in German. Another instance where it would be legitimate and again time effective to speak German is when you're teaching a grammar point, particularly to elementary students or students of relatively low ability, and they simply don't grasp it. You're explaining the present perfect, or you're explaining a conditional sentence, and they don't get it. Then it would be wise to switch out of English for just 1 minute, not longer, explain it clearly and simply in German, and then switch back into English. There are students who do in fact understand the grammar point when you explain it in English, but they want the reassurance of knowing that they have understood it correctly, and if you can then explain in German what it's all about, they feel a lot better. But basically, these are exceptions, and as a general rule, we would not use German in the classroom. I suppose the third case where you might use German is an emergency, like a fire, where you're teaching elementary students and you want to give them instructions like, let's get out of the room as fast as possible. Of course, then you use German. In the classroom, don't let your students chat to you in German and tell you how difficult it is for them to remember how to use the simple present or make questions in the simple past. And don't let them tell you in German that because it's so difficult for them to learn, they're going to learn it at home. That doesn't work. Students who resort to German in the classroom and prefer to chat away in German and then tell you, well, they'll learn all their grammar or their vocabulary at home. In fact, they don't do it. The place to learn it is in the classroom, through practice, simple practice, and drilling, if necessary, of grammar points. Using texts in the classroom that include German. This is something that personally I avoid. There are texts. There is a well-known magazine available in German bookshops which presents itself as an English magazine for students learning English, for German students learning English. And the articles in the magazine, in my view, are not authentic news items. They are not what you would normally find in a newspaper or magazine. They are deliberately written for students of German. They're contrived. And invariably, on the page, in the text, there are German words. There is usually a German introduction, and there is usually a list of vocabulary in German and English at the end of the article. Because of the inclusion of German, I feel that a student reading such a text in the classroom, is tempted to start speaking German, and because the text includes German words, may read in German. And that means they're not focusing 100% on the use of English. If you're constantly switching from English to German and back again, looking at vocabulary and saying, oh, this means that and this means that, then you're getting away from this saturation approach to use the target language, namely English, exclusively in the classroom. So my recommendation would be stick to authentic English language material like newspaper articles, magazine articles, material you get from the internet, and don't present texts which contain a mixture of English and German. Also, speak English yourself. Don't get into the habit, as some people unfortunately do after living in Germany for some time, of mixing German in your English language. When you're speaking English, stick to English. Don't say things like that you're going to take the Straßenbahn to the Bahnhof because you want to buy some fresh Brötchen, and maybe on the way home you'll sit and read the Zeitung. This is neither English nor German. This is just an ugly mixture. So please stick to English. And what's more, we have a policy of extending the English language environment outside of the classroom. That means if you meet one of your students in the corridor, in the reception, or in the canteen, speak in English with them so that they get used to speaking with you in English wherever they meet you, whether it's in the classroom or in the street. Carry with you an English-German dictionary, just a small one. This has two purposes. One, that if, as I mentioned earlier, it's necessary to give a quick translation, then you've got a dictionary at hand. You can look up an obscure adjective or verb, whatever it is, and you can give the German equivalent. Also, if you're not sure of your spelling of an English word, you can use the dictionary to check your spelling. If you're not sure of how to spell a word, and you don't have, well, you should have your dictionary with you, but if you're not sure how to spell a word, then say so, and then check it at home and tell your students the correct spelling the next time you meet them. Please remember to give your students your telephone number so that if they need to cancel a lesson, they can ring you. They don't need to ring me and ask me to ring you. They can simply ring you. If you have a mobile phone, please ensure that it's switched off during the lesson. And finally, politics. Don't allow yourself to be drawn into a political argument with your students. It may well be that you start off a discussion about some topic in economics or business, and the next thing you know, it becomes political. And it may well be that one of your students expresses a political view which is very different to your own. You're not there to engage in political argument, to persuade the students of the soundness of your political view. You're there to teach English. So by all means engage in a political discussion, but avoid confrontation. Don't let yourself get wound up by a student, and don't wind a student up. You can play devil's advocate. You can present an alternative point of view, but don't get emotionally involved and don't argue with your students. Maybe some of those points sound rather negative, but I think they are worth bearing in mind, and I hope that these points, together with everything that you saw already in the training session, will serve as a sound basis for you when teaching. And I wish you the best of luck in your teaching experiences with Finer English. Thank you. Hello again. There are two other points that I overlooked, but which are important, which I would like to finish with now. They are related. The first concerns confidentiality, the second concerns gossip. Students will trust you. They will confide in you. They will tell you all kinds of business information, including the business strategy, their plans for the future projects, problems. They will talk about their colleagues. They will tell you many, many things. Please treat all such information with strict confidence. Keep it in the classroom. Don't share it with anyone else. And if you go to your next lesson and your student tells you about a coming takeover that's being planned, don't say, "Oh yes, I know about this, Mr. Schmidt told me in my lesson yesterday." Whatever you hear from one student or one group of students, keep your confidence with those students and don't take it anywhere else. Secondly, where we teach large companies employing several hundred people, Many of them have worked together for many years. They know each other and they have a history. Maybe they have a history stretching back more than 20 years. Maybe they remember when someone was promoted above them and they still haven't forgotten it. They still resent it and they tell you about it. Or they tell you that one of their colleagues is lazy or unreliable or something negative about that person or about that person's private life. Don't react, don't engage in gossip about employees of the company, and certainly don't take it anywhere else outside of the classroom. Leave it in the classroom. And I think that really is the end now of this training video. Thank you very much for watching it. I hope you found it useful. And again, I wish you all the best in your teaching experience with Finer English.